Talk.
Good morning. Good morning. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes,
Hello?
we can. Hello.
Yes, we can hear you, Nkechi, along
Oh,
with.
okay. All right, good morning. I'm really sorry. I had some very serious internet challenges. So we'll be starting in about a minute. NESG, can you please share the program? Can you share the program now, please? I trust you have done sound check for everybody. NESG, please, can you share the program? Okay. Thank you. All right, so we'll start with the introductions. I'll take the introductions. I'll introduce everybody on the panel. And then Mrs. Adetayo, Madam, you will take the welcome address as a board member of NESG. Then I would hand over to our co-chair, GIPC, Mr. Aig Scholarships, to take the opening special remarks before we go to Dr. Dipolu to present the paper. The discussion will follow the format as stated in the program. Mr. Akin will speak first. After Mr. Akin, could we go down on this, please, NESG? NESG, can we see the rest of the program? After Mr. Aki, then Dr. Meribule will speak, and then finally, Mrs. Aig Scholarships will speak. We have 20 minutes for the question and answers. Each speaker has roughly 5 to 7 minutes, except for Mr. Dr. Dipolu that has, if I'm correct, 30 minutes to speak. Then we will take a 5 minutes brief on GIPC. This is to solicit for members to join us. And then finally, our co-chair, private sector, Mr. Aig Scholarships will also take the closing remarks. I don't know if there are any questions before we go live with everybody else.
So am I meant to take
Sir?
10 minutes? I should keep my comments to 10 minutes, right?
Yes, sir, for the beginning part, and then you have 5 minutes at the end as well.
Okay. Nkechi, my understanding is I have 15 minutes.
Yes. Can I see Mr. Dr. Dipolu's slide, please? I mean, on the program. Can I see Dr. Dipolu's? Yes, sir, you have 15 minutes. You have 15 minutes to speak. Is that okay, sir? Would you want more time?
No, I planned for 15. So
All
when
right,
you
sir.
mentioned 30, I was wondering.
All right, sir, that's okay. So if we have the permission of everybody, we would now open up and allow participants to view, and we will start. Or should we give it another 2 minutes so we start exactly 11:05? Mr. Chairman, sir, what's your viewpoint?
No, we don't start late.
Okay, so NESG, please open up.
We're live.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. You're welcome to the Governance and Institutions Policy Commission, GIPC, NESG, Nigerian Economic Summit Group webinar. The webinar is titled Government and Private Sector Engagement in the Times of COVID-19 Pandemic and Beyond. All our panelists are in, you're welcome, and we will start immediately. I'll just do a brief introduction. Unfortunately, we have the apologies of the head of service, Dr. Folashade Yemieson. She had to go for another engagement promptly this morning. We have our co-chair, private sector, also founder of Africa Initiative for Governance, Mr. Aig Scholarships, he's the co-chair of this session. Our keynote speaker is no other than the special advisor to the president on economic matters, Dr. Adeyemi Dipolu. Our discussants are Dr. Emmanuel Mebibole. He's the permanent secretary, office of the head of service of the Federation. We also have Mrs. Ofowe Aig. She's the director of African Initiative of Governance. And we have Mr. Aig Scholarships. He's the senior technical assistant, economic matters to the president from the office of the vice president. Again, we have our board member, Mrs. Wonu Adetayo, who will be taking the welcome address now. Mrs. Wonu.
Thank you very much, Nkechi, and thank you very much for all of our attendees this morning. We want to say thank you for being present, and we assure you that it will be an exciting and productive time for each and every one of us. The head of service, who is absent, as we have just been told, heads of ministries, departments, and agencies of government, captains of industries, members of the international community, gentlemen of the press, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the chairman and the board of the Nigeria Economic Summit Group, I'm pleased to welcome you to this webinar, which is being hosted by the NESG's Governance and Institutions Policy Commission, which is called the GIPC. And the theme of this webinar is government and private sector engagement in the times of the COVID-19 pandemic and beyond. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, it is no longer news that many countries have been faced with unprecedented challenges from COVID-19, and the strain on governments have been extreme. Indeed, the impact on people all over the world, you would say, have been far-reaching. Now, when we take a look at the Nigeria situation, we'll find that our situation has been particularly extreme, especially the impact on people. For example, Nigeria has recorded 179,118 confirmed cases of infected persons. Some people will say, come on, this compared to what is going on globally, I think it's the capacity to cope that we really should be worried about, right? And then infected persons have been, 2,194 deaths have happened as a result of the pandemic. This is as at 10th of August, 2021. Unfortunately, we have a daily average now of confirmed cases of 516 in the last few days. Therefore, Nigeria is already experiencing its third wave of the pandemic, and the COVID-19 remains a highly infectious disease, which can be transmitted via symptomatic or asymptomatic individuals. Many of us are already seeing this reality playing out, even in families, even with close associates. The COVID-19 experience has shown that it is vital for governments to provide accurate, useful, and up-to-date information to people, particularly during the times of crisis. It is even important to involve private sector, which include civil society organizations, businesses, social entrepreneurs, and the general public in the process of managing the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as its aftermath. We believe that when this is done, it can improve the situation because there will be highly effective policies and decision makers will become more involved in the process. Our opinion is that online engagement initiatives that have been led by government can help people to cope with the crisis as well as improve government operations. Therefore, for us, taking a closer look at technology utilization during the COVID-19 pandemic, government has generally demonstrated a lack of the needed financial and human resource capabilities to quickly and efficiently develop digital tools that can support people during a crisis. Therefore, building partnerships with private technology companies, social entrepreneurs, or other national and international organizations obviously offers an effective way for government to make use of existing and new technologies to meet the needs of people and to soften the impact of the crisis on the lives of the common Nigerian. It is noteworthy that there are significant risks of abuse of access during times of crisis. As such, bottom-up accountability approaches are crucial to ensure funds allocated for the pandemic reach their intended destinations. Today's webinar is therefore intended to help articulate clear, practical, and concrete recommendations for the short and medium term to be implemented by both the public and private sectors, as well as other stakeholders, especially in the post-COVID-19 world that is driven by digitization. At the NESG, it is our sincere hope that today's strategic deliberation will produce outcomes that will facilitate the much needed engagement between government and the private sector. Once again, on behalf of the board of the Nigeria Economic Summit Group, I want to say thank you very much for being present, and may God bless our country, Nigeria.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Wonu Adetayo. Thank you. It's always a pleasure to see you, madam. Without wasting any more time, we would invite our co-chair private sector, founder of African Initiative of Governance, Mr. Aig Scholarships, to please give us the opening remarks and any special remarks. Mr. Co-chair, sir.
Thank you, Nkechi. And I do hope you can all hear me. Well, Wonu Adetayo has welcomed all of us to what I believe is going to be an extremely productive webinar. The Governance and Institutions Policy Commission, GIPC, of the NESG is co-chaired by Dr. Folashade Yemi-Eson, who is the head of service, and myself. She representing the public sector, and me representing the private sector. And whilst during the course of this webinar, you will learn more about the GIPC's work, I would need to, of course, introduce the reason why perhaps I represent the private sector in this commission. So in my role as co-founder and chairperson of the African Initiative for Governance, which is a subsidiary of the Aig Foundation, we at the African Initiative for Governance, AIG as an acronym, basically we focus on being a catalyst for public sector transformation. And essentially we try and connect the public sector with private sector skills, with innovation, with leadership, and very importantly, funding. And I believe that these themes will continue to recur throughout the course of this webinar. Essentially, the work of the GIPC is to leverage on the work that the Nigerian Economic Summit Group has done over 20 years with respect to collaboration between the public and the private sector, and create a focus and emphasis on governance and institutional reform. The co-chairs have worked very closely with all members of the commission, and we have a number of work streams, one of which is led by today's speaker. And when I say speaker, I'm referring to our keynote speaker, who is Dr. Adeyemi Dikolu, the special advisor to the president on economic affairs. And this particular work stream that he drives is really focused on strengthening partnerships and collaboration between the public and private sector, which is front and center what we're going to be talking about, today. So to kind of set the tone, what I would like to do is whilst I avoid repeating what has been said with respect to the impact of COVID-19 on Nigeria, I must emphasize that all over the world, this pandemic has strained the resources of government, and the impact on people is far-reaching. Now, whilst, and I just checked the NCDC website, I believe that the deaths in Nigeria, as at, let's say last night, stood at 2,288. African countries have benefited from the lowest infection rates across the world. And we give God the glory for that, because as Wanu said, our levels of preparation for a more significant health and medical impact may have found us wanting. Thus far, on the health and medical side, to a large extent, like most other African nations, maybe with the exception of South Africa and one or two North African nations, Nigeria has coped quite well. But the economic and social effects of COVID-19 have been very serious. And we have been very challenged as a nation to respond. We are now in the third wave of the pandemic, and the message really about waves of pandemics is, and let's not get into any real, medical or public health, policy lingo. It's just simply that this is not a pandemic that comes in one wave and you deal with it 1 year. Serious pandemics tend to require sometimes multi-generational responses. To be honest, countries that deal with pandemics and deal with them well approach pandemics as a marathon battle. And so this is not something that, despite our best intentions, is going to go away anytime soon. Now, the global response has seen the health industry, and by health industry, when you talk about Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca, and all of these companies coming to the fore with, for example, vaccines and more, the health industry and the private sector, have been engaged globally, because without, these two key stakeholders, the means to address the pandemic will just not be there. And so it's no surprise that in Nigeria as well, the health sector and the private sector have been engaged. At the emergency response level, so let me just say the initial response level in Nigeria, I think that if you look at the health sector overall, the hospitals, the health workers, and both on the private and the public side, they've done well in terms of an emergency response. And then when you look at the private sector coalitions, you can say prominent amongst them are the ones, the COVID and then the petroleum sector group. Again, worthy of commendation. There are others. But beyond the initial response to the pandemic, the emergency, let's get together and let's put up emergency structures to deal with what could have been a far worse rate of infection and the issues and challenges are associated with that. The real issue now is that, as I've said, this is a marathon, and yes, we've had our initial response on the health side in terms of some emergency health infrastructure, and thankfully the pressure from the infection rates did not challenge us too much in terms of what we did. Certainly on the economic and social side, we have and continue to suffer. We've had the social unrest, which obviously to any well-meaning and any honest observer can be linked to the trauma of COVID-19, which helped, basically ignite a groundswell of interest, of a social nature. The economic effects, we've had double-dip recessions over the past 24 months, and the unemployment, indices are not particularly pleasing to anybody who has received it. So the challenge now is how to establish effective, broad-based, and sustainable public-private partnerships. We cannot rely on one emergency response after another emergency response after another emergency response. The effectiveness of these type of responses, frankly speaking, can be challenged, with evidence-based data. You can't deal with economic and social issues on an emergency basis perennially. And so what we need to do is change the emphasis of our public-private partnerships to those that can deliver capacity on an enduring basis, those that can bring expertise and tools to bear on an enduring basis, those that can bring technology, that will last to support government in restarting the economy and rebuilding societies. All over the world, the public sector, has leveraged on the capacity and capabilities of the private sector in this particular regard. Now, I do see that one of our speakers is Aig Scholarships, who is certainly the more accomplished and more brilliant part of the, if you like, Aig Scholarships duo as far as philanthropy is concerned. And she will speak to the work that the Aig Scholarships Foundation, has done and is doing, whether with respect to COVID directly, for example, the COVID tracker, but she'll speak to that, or with respect to the issues of digitization that Wanu spoke about. But at a high level, some of the things that will ensure that we have a sustainable ability as a nation to deal with the after effects and shockwaves that continue to flow through the world and through Nigeria from COVID-19 is one, first of all, the issue of access to and sharing information. I went to the NCDC site to give you the most up-to-date statistics on the medical side of COVID, but the economic and social aspects of COVID, there is, hardly any information. And as we've seen, the medical challenge is whilst there, and of course, 2,200 people dying is too many people. We've seen that that's not been Nigeria's big problem. So we've got to get our handle on social and economic data in a much better way, and we must be able to inform Nigerians of what the response to this economic and social challenge is. And in that regard, I go to the next big issue, which is engaging people. How well have we fared thus far in engaging people? And for instance, for example, if I speak to the vulnerable groups of society, which in Nigeria run in tens of millions, that aspect of society has largely gone unserved and underengaged, certainly. Partnering with public sector and with a partnership between the public and private sector with institutions that are focused on the vulnerable groups are also, particularly important. The NSSF initiative, between Global Citizens and the Nigerian Sovereign Investment Authority, which is a sovereign wealth fund, has been doing some interesting work. But I think we really need to scale up our engagement with the vulnerable groups. Then I spoke to the fact that we have had some multi-stakeholder partnerships, the oil and gas sector, we've had COVID, etc. But in terms of technology and government, scaling up multi-stakeholder partnerships, I think a lot more can be done. And it can only be done with a deliberate strategy of, giving responsibility to certain people in government to say, okay, fine. Early responses came from these groups, okay? Do these groups represent the totality of the private sector and what can be brought to bear? And the answer obviously is certainly not. How can we, draw in and crowd in even more so that we can scale up that which has been done to date? I think that thus far, in terms of the resources that the private sector, have available to the nation to deal with COVID-19, we are still talking about fractions of what, in terms of what has been mobilized thus far. And the key issue is that, the Nigerian private sector, when it comes to dealing with the public sector, typically needs to be invited. And there is the reality of, thus, even though we've had decades now of democratic civilian rule, we've had a long history of military rule, some of which, involve this dictatorship. So when you are dealing with the private sector, the government needs to invite, embrace, and bring in and draw in a private sector that is just learning how to, deal with the public sector in a let me say, sophisticated manner. Then, of course, there's accountability, which is what happens with the resources that are mobilized, so to speak. I mean, we've had some unpleasant experiences over the past months, and you can explain that. Unpleasant experiences don't necessarily mean that good work has not been done. It just points to the fact that from an accountability and governance standpoint, better work needs to be done. So these are the comments that I would like to use to kind of set the stage, for our discussion. I do really miss my co-chair, Dr. Yemi Eson. I wish he was here, but understanding the dictates of government and a very significant role in government, her inability to participate is very well understood. So we're about to hear from Dr. Dikpeolu, but let me hand the floor, or should I say the virtual system, back to our moderator. Over.
Thank you very much, Mr. Aig Scholarships, for that very, very well put together opening remarks. We're on the webinar organized by the Nigerian Economic Summit Group with the Governance and Institutions Policy Commission, GIPC. And the theme for the webinar, again, is government and private sector engagement in the times of COVID-19 pandemic and beyond. We're now going to ask our keynote speaker, who, as I introduced earlier, is a special advisor to the President on Economic Matters. And as our co-chair, private sector has pointed out, also the thematic lead for the Strengthening Public-Private Sector Partnership thematic group of the GIPC, Dr. Adeyemi Dikpeolu. You're welcome, sir.
Thank you very much, Nkechi. I would like to say thank you to Mr. Aigboji Mokwede, chair of this occasion, founder of the African Initiative for Governance. And I also like to thank Mrs. Wanu Adetayo for her introductory welcome remarks. So, Chief Executives from the public and private sector, distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen, I appreciate the opportunity to say a few words at this webinar on government and private sector engagement in times of the COVID-19 pandemic and beyond, organized by the Governance and Institutions Policy Commission of the Nigerian Economic Summit Group. The GIPC, which is focused on private sector collaboration with the public sector, including through institutional development and partnerships, is co-chaired by Mrs. Folashade Yemi Eson, head of the Civil Service of the Federation, and Mr. Aigboji Mokwede, founder of the African Initiative for Governance, who have both brought uncommon passion to their assignment and showed that with such commitment, collaboration between the public and private sectors can be impactful and yield positive outcomes. So I salute both of you. To provide some background, this webinar was conceptualized by the Strengthening Partnerships and Collaboration Thematic Working Group of the GIPC during the first wave of the pandemic and the accompanying lockdown. At that time, it was clear that governments, federal and state alike, would face a number of serious challenges as a result of the pandemic, and that all sectors of society would have to come together, would have to work together, have to be mobilized to help cope with the situation. The GIPC felt in this context that it would be important to ponder on how governments could be assisted by the private sector and other actors to tackle the pandemic and ameliorate the socio-economic fallout. At that time, this webinar was initially conceived as an important element in thinking through the situation. No one realized or even thought that we'll be battling third waves and fourth waves in some other parts of the world, indeed, by this time in 2021. It only goes to show that we have a new normal in which we just have to get along with our lives. We have had to resume our efforts to tackle poverty and achieve sustainable growth while using vaccinations and non-pharmaceutical interventions to fight the spread of the virus, especially its now deadly Delta variant. In other words, while the pandemic presents challenges to governance and economy in the country, it also provides opportunities for public-private sector collaboration beyond mere rhetoric and dialogue. Immediate responses. Our experience to date shows that our topic is particularly apt because it helps to focus attention on how the government and the private sector can work together in the COVID-19 era. The immediate challenge faced during the first wave and lockdown was how to reach people whose movements had been restricted so as to provide them with information, guidance, and updates from government, which itself needed real-time information on the spread and the impact of the virus. This is where virtual and digital platforms came to the rescue, such that we all learned how to hold events, access services, and carry out transactions on them. A situation which was not so clear or evident in April 2020. The strength of the private sector, especially the telecoms operators, the financial technology companies, and app developers, came to the fore in this period. A key lesson learned in this regard is that many of the challenges facing us, many of the development challenges facing us today can be tackled through a robust adoption of technology. Potential solutions range from improving the delivery of education using digital content, deepening financial inclusion, especially for the distribution, especially through the expansion of digital payments systems, especially for the distribution of social benefits. Indeed, it also became quite clear that technology has to be used to strengthen accountability and bring people closer to government. It was also evident at the onset of the pandemic that government did not have the resources to overcome the effects all by itself. There were few, if any, there were few, perhaps about 5 laboratories in the country that could carry out the required PCR tests. Similarly, the ICU beds were few and far between, and the personal protective equipment, face masks, oxygen cylinders, and even sanitizers were in short supply. Government also lacked the data with which to properly target interventions, especially for the distribution of palliatives and other forms of support. The private sector also rose to the occasion in this instance through the provision of additional health facilities, palliatives, and awareness campaigns, as well as technology-enabled solutions to overcome healthcare challenges. The COVID-19 pandemic precipitated, indeed, a global health and economic crisis that affected not just the outlook of Nigeria, but indeed of nearly all economies in the world. The Nigerian economy fell into a recession as a result of the first wave of the pandemic, with many more people also falling into poverty as a result. And at that same time, we suffered from high inflation and high unemployment. Using targeted fiscal, monetary, and real sector measures, the federal government's response was through the Economic Sustainability Plan, which aimed to save and create jobs, boost local production, while helping businesses to stay afloat. It is important to stress that the real sector measures in the Economic Sustainability Plan were all about supporting the private sector in order to boost agricultural production, to construct houses, to provide solar power, and promote the use of gas as quickly as possible. This process also brought about the MSME Survival Fund, which gave support to small businesses, and to the development of a rapid response register to provide support to the urban poor. But together, all these interventions also provided a pool of data which can guide policy making going forward. The cheering news this morning is that the economy grew in the second quarter by 5.01% this year, second quarter of this year. So it is clear that some of our interventions, although there is, of course, a base effect, some of the interventions have helped to turn around the fortunes of the economy significantly. Now, quite distinct from the immediate responses that enabled Nigeria to cope with the worst of the pandemic, I think it would also be important, as we discuss the engagement of the public and private sector, to look more closely at other key areas of intervention going forward, and given that the pandemic is still very much with us. I think the first is cooperation to strengthen the public service. I'll talk about that. Prior to the pandemic, the public service faced several challenges, as a result of which the Office of the Head of Civil Service of the Federation drew up a 2017-2020 Federal Civil Service Strategy and Implementation Plan with the support of the private sector, led by the African Initiative for Governance, which also brought McKinsey on board. The pandemic has made the situation even more complex because it has significantly disrupted the nature of work. Since work in the COVID-19 era now involves remote work, virtual meetings, data management, and automation, amongst other things, it is clear that digitization of government is now an all-important necessity. However, with the support of the private sector, their expertise, tools, and leading technologies, government can become more responsive to the current digital landscape and be better prepared for longer-term disruptions which are being caused by the pandemic. Perhaps a silver lining from the pandemic would be faster adoption of technology for governance, provision of digital government services, increased productivity, and utilization of data protection tools for information sharing. These changes, I believe, are well reflected in the new strategy for 2021 to 2025 of the civil service, which will prioritize and address critical issues like capacity building, performance management, human resources management, innovation, digitalization, and staff welfare. The private sector can and should support these priorities, including through talent embedding programs, peer learning, and mobility assignments. I'd also like to think that deliberation councils are another important way of collaboration during these difficult times. Perhaps one of the most important ways in which the private and public sectors can collaborate is through deliberation councils. These institutional structures are important for engagement between both sectors and will help to build trust and confidence between industry leaders and policymakers. A version of this existed is no longer in active operation with the Presidential Quarterly Business Forum, which helped to ensure that government understood the needs of the private sector and the challenges they face, while it also shares its policy proposals and gains the perspective of the private sector on its economic initiative. Quite encouragingly, I think, in this context, the private sector, especially the Nigerian Economic Summit Group, was actively involved in drawing up the new medium-term national development plan. I think deliberation councils are also important in the era of COVID-19, where all hands must be on deck. to cope with the pandemic, including through the provision of vaccinations by those who have more resources to support developing countries, just as we all have to now begin to think of how to cope with climate change. And for an economy like Nigeria, which is dependent on oil for revenues and export earnings, we have to begin to think and push towards a just transition so that we can even use things like gas for power generation. But similarly and equally complex, we have to adapt to the fourth industrial revolution, which in particular impacts on manufacturing through 3D printing. And yet we're going to need manufacturing to create that large number of jobs that will help a country like Nigeria to keep its economy growing fast and in a sustainable manner. I think also important as part of the things deliberation councils should be working on is our participation in the African Continental Free Trade Area. The private sector, which contains the real players in the production and export of goods and services, must help to shape the outcomes and should be actively involved in negotiations under the auspices of the African Continental Free Trade Area. I'd now like to speak about public-private partnerships writ large. I think these partnerships are well recognized as instruments for undertaking economic activities that government cannot undertake solely, especially for the provision of social support, infrastructure, and investment in businesses. Social interventions are one means through which the public and private sector can work, and this was evident at the height of the crisis. We had, as was mentioned by the chair, the Coalition Against COVID-19, CACOVID, which was a swift response by the private sector to support government bodies in combating the virus and its effects. It's quite commendable that CACOVID was able to pool resources speedily to provide additional health facilities and services, as well as awareness campaigns. There are also opportunities for collaboration going forward to develop critical infrastructure to help stimulate economic activity and mitigate the economic impact of the pandemic. Indeed, such partnerships are integral to the mobilization of finance and the provision of facilities in key sectors like power, roads, rail, ports, and broadband networks. The Road Infrastructure Tax Credit Scheme, through which companies undertake to build roads in exchange for tax credits, is a good example of this. Also of interest is the recent establishment of the Infrastructure Corporation of Nigeria, INFRACO, which provides an opportunity for private sector participation in efforts to bridge our current national infrastructure deficit. Going forward, opportunities for joint investment, such as exist in the Nigerian liquefied natural gas, can also further explored, including, for instance, investment in local vaccine production. I think BioVaccines Limited, the joint venture between the federal government and May and Baker Nigeria to produce vaccines, is a particularly relevant example in the COVID-19 era, and much more should and can be done in the area of medical research and innovation. I will speak briefly to remind us that when we talk of the private sector, we must also remember that micro, small, and medium enterprises are also part and parcel of the private sector. And together they account for about 50% of economic output. So it's important that we also take into account the interest and the outlook of the small businesses as we begin to think of how to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. And so we've had, as I mentioned earlier, interventions such as the MSME Survival Fund, but also we've had interventions such as the MSME clinics, which help small businesses to interact more freely and to learn from the regulatory agencies that affect their lives going forward. So I conclude by saying that while the COVID-19 era has brought challenges, it has also brought opportunities. And there are several ways in which the public and the private sector can work together in this COVID era. Such collaboration is vital for shaping policy and executing interventions that can help us overcome COVID-related challenges and ultimately build a resilient nation. Together, we can beat the common enemy, but we must jointly navigate socioeconomic challenges, mitigate the risks associated with digital technologies and data sharing, and adapt to the uncertain and the evolving landscape ahead. Permit me to end by acknowledging the business leaders, senior civil servants, and members of the GIPC for giving of their time to come and participate in this webinar. I do hope that our exchange of views here will help to further cement close ties between the public and private sectors, which is what the NESG was set up to promote. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dikwelu, for that keynote paper. I would be inviting the discussants now to speak on aspects of the paper. The first discussant I would like to invite is Mr. Aig Scholarships, Special Senior Technical Assistant, Economic Matters to the President from the Office of the Vice President. Mr. Aig?
Thank you very much, Nkechi.
Thank you. Before you start, we've heard a lot from Dr. Dikwelu. He spoke extensively, especially about the growth in the second quarter of 2021, and that's good news because of the crisis that the world is in at the moment. But we do know that the COVID has had impact on all levels of government. We do know that there has to have been some changes in governance to be able to manage the crisis, and that this has had impacts on crisis management as well as policy reforms. Can you, while discussing Dr. Dikwelu's paper, just talk briefly on how you think the Nigerian government has better managed the crisis, or should I say adjusted their operations to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Nkechi. I would like to thank Mrs. Wonua Adetayo for her welcome address, and the co-chair of the Governance and Institutions Policy Commission, Mr. Aig Mokwede, for his opening remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, I think Dr. Dikwelu has captured quite succinctly the prevailing issues and trends in government and private sector engagement in the ongoing COVID-19 era. Before I go into the specific questions that Nkechi has asked, I just wanted to make a few comments. I think that gains have been made in terms of approaches to work and remote working, use of technology, digitalization of some key processes and services in response to the pandemic. However, given the scale of the challenges, the economic and social challenges that the pandemic has and continues to present, I think that there is an urgency to shore up the capability of the public service so that it is indeed fit for purpose and able to respond to the new challenges. So my focus really is not really on the substantive issues, but really on the hows, how we do things. And because I think this would also enrich the discussion, because yes, it's full of substantive content, which Dr. Dikwelu has mentioned, and also which the co-chair in his opening remarks has highlighted. Now, I think that challenges to the public sector, there are challenges to the public sector which even predates the pandemic and continue to plague the public service, and therefore also need to be addressed. Dr. Dikwelu referred to the new strategies for this civil service for 2021-2025, which will prioritize and address a range of critical areas. I think it will be important to resume the work on the Federal Civil Service Strategy and Implementation Plan. It's also important that this urgency is reflected in the speed with which areas and priorities are addressed. The issue becomes how the public service and government move with speed on these issues, move with the speed that is actually associated with, say, the private sector. On another level, collaboration with the private sector in terms of cooperation to strengthen the public service is aimed at supporting the development of responsive and effective machinery for the creation of an enabling environment for Nigerians and their businesses to thrive. This lies at the core of what the NESG does. As stakeholders, we have different needs or entry points into this equation. So as MDAs, for example, how are we contributing to the changes and reforms that need to be implemented? Attitudes to work and effectiveness changing accordingly? Are we championing the required changes in our organizations? Are we responding to the challenges of generating reliable data and socioeconomic data or evidence for planning and for public decision making? As private sector organizations, on the other hand, whether we are private for profit or private for non-profit, and as long as we are committed to the cause of enhancing partnerships and collaborations, what are we doing to strengthen the capability of the public service to deliver services to Nigerian people? The work that organizations like the Africa Initiative for Government does in identifying and developing public sector talent by sending them for training at the Blavatnik School of Government at Oxford and embedding advisors in public office is laudable. We can see the impact in terms of output of this program and the contribution to policy formulation and development. I think this is a model that is replicable and can be adopted by other organizations. The point here is really that as stakeholders, there is a need to be proactive in making change happen by doing something at their own end to contribute to achieving the required change. There's also need to take up opportunities. The pandemic laid bare the development challenges facing government, making all the more important those government initiatives to encourage private sector participation in driving economic growth and development. It's in this light that public-private partnerships should be considered. It's important for private sector organizations to take up the opportunities provided as part of their cooperation with government to achieve development goals. I recall in the 90s and 2000s, and in a practice that still continues today, when the South Korean government announced any initiative, the big chaebols would lap up the opportunity. But the smaller organizations would also form consortia to take advantage of those opportunities. I think this is a model that can be adopted even now. And in this way, that's how they cooperated with government, enabling their government to achieve its development goals while also benefiting from the relationship. The government's economic plan provides such initiatives and opportunities for the private sector to get involved and align with the country's strategic economic objectives, even for profit. Dr. Dikpaolu also mentioned deliberation councils, which I thought was really key. It's important that output from these councils are fed as input for implementation by MDAs. Sector and industry leaders should be able to follow up at ministerial level so that relevant ministries and agencies can respond and create opportunities for the private sector. So essentially, those are 4 key points: urgency and speed, proactive stakeholders, taking up opportunities, and follow-up channels. Now, with regard to Ms. Nkechi's specific questions on what COVID-19 has changed in terms of policy making, fiscal and financial management, regulation, and crisis and risk management. Well, as far as policy is concerned, the way we work is very key. So I think there's been development in remote working, things like greater inclusion, wider stakeholder participation in framing issues. And this we can see through the involvement of different stakeholders in dialogue sessions and in meetings like this, webinars like this. In terms of fiscal and financial management, I think there's also greater transparency and accountability, you know, as is required, because we found out that to address COVID-19, took more than the resources that we have to address them. We had to go outside to the international community to look for funding to help with our response to COVID. And it's required, before you can access international financing to address COVID, you must comply with certain transparency and accountability rules, which is going on in MDAs, and I think that is worth noting. Crisis and risk management, I think it highlighted the importance of data and its management, the use of technology to provide services to the public, the value of engaging the private sector in these areas to develop the required technology to address problems. So the use of technology to address for problem solving, I think we've increased our capability in that, and the involvement of the private sector also in this. The performance of the National Center for Disease Control, I think, has made it possible to see what is achievable in terms of its application to the crisis at hand, as well as its performance given the resources available to it. I think it has done quite well. Also, it has worked with all sectors to achieve whatever sector successes it has had. So I think most important also, one thing we've realized that COVID-19 has also brought to the fore is the need to be inclusive and address the needs of different sections of the population, particularly of the vulnerable sections of the population. So I think I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shweton. That was very good. Thank you so much. I would like to call the next discussant, Dr. Mary Boulay. Dr. Mary Boulay, welcome. All the speakers have said a lot. Dr. Mary Boulay, are you on?
Yeah, thank you, I'm on.
Okay. All the speakers have said a lot, and I think one thing there's a consensus about is that the public and private sector need to work together, and that the public and the private sector has a lot to contribute to economic growth. And we know the importance of the civil service in every government in the world, especially in the capacity of a government to deliver on its policies, and quality service is highly dependent on the professionalism and the integrity of the civil service, who should be managed according to international and EU standards. We do know that a lot has been done by the civil service, especially under the head of civil service. Could you just speak to us to know ways in which the public sector and the private sector can support the civil service so as to build capacity as to how to operate in the crisis period we find ourselves, while also speaking on some of the points raised by Dr. Dipolu. Dr. Mary Boulay, you're muted, so we can't hear you. You're muted, please. Okay.
Yeah. So let me start by thanking you for inviting us to this webinar, and also the chairman, the board member that spoke earlier, Dr. Dipolu and Mr. Sultan, for their contribution. Actually, when I heard Mr. Sultan speaking, it was as if he was addressing the issues of the public sector vis-a-vis the civil service. But primarily, COVID-19 pandemic brought to us the problem with pandemics all over the world. And particularly for the civil service, it was a test case. However, support of the civil service when it was needed. Let me address the question I have, because I have very few minutes, with respect to what happened at the height of the COVID and what we are doing currently to be able to address the challenges and also look beyond COVID. At the beginning of the COVID pandemic, the private sector was in collaboration with the civil service all the way, starting from the head of the civil service to the health sector. It appeared was championing the issue of COVID, the issue of awareness creation, the issue of logistics support, the issue of the initial plan, even with the presidential task force on COVID. The private sector was involved all the way, and they provided enormous support in terms of knowledge, in terms of skill, and also help to change the attitude in the way we approach work, particularly for some of you who are very conversant with the civil service. Certain things need to be done in terms of getting permissions, necessary permissions before you act. And these things cannot be done during an emergency situation like a pandemic situation. So the civil service came to our rescue during that period. I also want to state that all the policies that were evolved during the initial period from March till the later period of July 2020, the private sector was well informed, was well involved, even in the production of the protocol for handling COVID. Throughout. They were also involved in the tracking of funds. They were also involved in the digital apps that we use in doing data analytics with respect to where we push both infrastructure and what have you, and even in the building of the infrastructure. But particularly in the head of the civil service of the Federation, we had a plan spanning from 2017 to 2020. And that plan was premised on certain key levers, one of which is capacity building, performance management, ensuring a culture change that makes us efficient, productive, citizen-centered, and being efficient in whatever we are doing. We also had the issue of ensuring that we digitize some of the processes that has our data analysis output, making sure that the human resource component of the integrated personnel payroll system was optimized. In all this, the COVID pandemic slowed down the progress of this plan. However, I want to say that with the support of stakeholders, we're able to continue to work even amidst the COVID. For instance, under the innovation pillar of the plan, we had innovation competitions, which was supported by the private sector, where we selected people that had good innovation ideas, which we intend to bring to bear in the service. And these are all things that are pertaining to ICT. Two, we continued with our training, like the induction, the SMART P, structured mandatory assessment training program in the service, with the support of also the private sector, including what we call the Leadership Advancement and Development Program, which is a crop of top-level civil servants that will help drive the plan. This was also supported by our private sector stakeholders, including the Aig Foundation. I want to also state that in whatever we are doing in the civil service, even including this period, we've had the private sector coming to bear. And this we do in terms of looking at our policies, having discussions or brainstorming with respect to our approaches. And with the digitization, which Mr. Soeton mentioned earlier, we have developed standard operating procedures within the Office of the Head of Service. In fact, with the support of the African Initiative for Governance, and we're trying to roll out this service-wide so that everybody will be, every service will be part of it, because this is the beginning of the digitization of contents within the service. Under capacity building, which we have talked about severally, the collaboration with the private sector has also helped us extend beyond the shores of Nigeria. The public leadership program that you mentioned with the School of Oxford, AIG, and the Black-Vanik School of Public Leadership is also a case in point. It was extended to civil servants. And the whole essence is to ensure that we have a professionalized civil service that is resilient, and able to adapt to whatever changes that come our way. But more importantly, within the civil service, we are in the process of finalizing a plan that will sustain the gains of the previous plan. That is Federal Civil Service Strategy and Implementation Plan 2017 to 2020. We are about finalizing the plan 2021 to 2025 that will take us into the new phase of civil service. And in that plan, we have 6 pillars. We are continuing with capacity building and talent sourcing. We are bringing in the issue of performance management with respect to key performance indicators so that civil servants will know their job objectives and be able to be held accountable for things to do, of course, with timelines. And of course, we need to digitize the platform for this performance management. We're also looking at the IPPS human resource module, integrated personnel payroll information system. We're also moving on the innovation to another level by ensuring that it's one of the basic pillars of the new plan, and digitization of all our content services. In this connection, as part of the budgetary input by MDAs, the head of service has directed that they should include digitization as part of their budget input, because most times it's funding mechanism that is also a problem. And also we are looking at staff welfare, where we bring in the private sector, even in compensation mechanisms, including housing for civil servants. All this we also developed in partnership with the private sector. And we're also calling on them too, to look at areas they can support. The chairman of AIG happens to be part and parcel of the steering committee in trying to ensure that this plan is finalized or gets FEC approval in the next few weeks so that we can start implementation. But it's also important to say that from the lead speaker's presentation, some of the suggestions that we are given, such as deliberation council, is something we need to also take in as a way forward. And the culture change, which he mentioned severally. And of course, ensuring that we have the right infrastructure within the service to be able to ensure that this plan is implemented. However, the importance of technology cannot be overemphasized. As at this moment, civil servants below level 12 are still at home. And the only way we can communicate with them is through technology. And by the time they imbibe the culture of using all the IT solutions, it means people can work from their house. So the civil service of the future is a service where we need professionalism, where we need to digitize most of the things we do, where we need to work remotely, and where we need to have the right culture to be able to ensure that the private sector, working with them, will be able to deliver a civil service of our dream. Let me stop here, but I need to say that the collaboration with the private sector is essential for making the civil service resilient in the face of this pandemic and any future disruption in the structure and work of the civil service going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Meribule. Most interesting for us, I think I got was the 6 pillars that the civil service is working on forward: the capacity building, talent resourcing, performance management, the HR model, digitalization, and staff welfare. These are very important pillars. And from what you said, already the private sector, especially the African Initiative of Governance and the NESG, has been working with the civil service to help professionalize the service. I would be inviting the 3rd speaker, Mrs. Ofowe Aikimogede. She will be the lady in the house. She'll be speaking to us on, as I said, generally on the paper presented by Dr. Dipolu, And in addition, we would like to hear her views as to what she proposes should be the way forward for public-private sector engagement. A lot has been said. So based on your experience and your skills, what do you propose should be the way forward for engagement, Mrs. Aig Scholarships?
Thank you very much, Nkechi, and thank you to all the previous speakers. Thank you to Dr. Adigbeolu for an excellent keynote address. Dr. Adigbeolu highlighted some of the areas in which the private sector could engage with the public sector. I'd like to focus on one specific area he discussed, namely cooperation to strengthen the public service, and use the work that the Aig Foundation entities, Africa Initiative for Governance, and the Aig Institute have been doing to illustrate the possibilities that are open to the private sector to engage with the public sector. To give some background, in 2017, we signed a memorandum of understanding with the Office of the Head of the Civil Service to support its reform efforts. And as Dr. Adigbeolu stated in his paper, we engaged McKinsey to actually come up with the strategy document that guided reform efforts from 2017. We've been actively partnering with the Office of the Head of the Civil Service since that time. We are committed to the enhancements of public sector transformation and have been deliberate in our efforts to engage with the OHCSF and find ways in which we can contribute. As Mr. Shoaton said, private sector entities need to engage actively and make themselves available to the public sector, and find ways in which they can bring their skills and their resources to bear. It's important to note, however, that private sector and public sector entities differ fundamentally in the way that they work. And it was very important when we came into the partnership, because we think of it as a partnership, to not think that we were the saviors who had all the answers. Rather, we were open to learning and understanding how best we could contribute. In that way, we have been able to build and develop a relationship of trust that has seen us empowered in a way to work closely with the Office of the Head of the Civil Service and make interventions that we feel will create the greatest impact. So as Dr. Adigbeolu stated, the pandemic significantly disrupted the nature of work, and it brought urgency to the need for the government to actively explore the digitalization of its processes that would allow it to continue to provide goods and services to the people. The first thing that we did as the Africa Initiative for Governance was that we collaborated with the Office of the Head of the Civil Service to create procedures and policies for virtual work, to allow the work to continue virtually, even in the height of lockdown. And so over the past year and a half, we have also worked closely with civil servants across the 26 departments of the OHCSF to prepare for the introduction of an enterprise content management solution, which will automate the department's processes, thus digitalizing their work. Dr. Meribule referred to the SOP development, and it's the first step. So the development of SOPs, standard operating procedures, was the first step in this digitalization process. And we're very pleased that the exercise was so successful that it's now being rolled out across the various MDAs using the template that we created together with the department champions of the Office of the Head of the Civil Service. So in the course of this project, not only have we provided the funding, but we have also leveraged on the experience of digitalization in the private sector and brought best practice to bear in the project implementation. Capacity building is also key. So we have worked very closely with the various departments of the Office of the Head of Civil Service to build capacity in their own teams. And it is these teams who are going out to the various MDAs to sort of teach them about how to develop their own SOPs. Referring to capacity building, through the Aig Institute, we have been actively engaged with building capacity in the public sector workforce. And Mr. Shoton referred to the Aig Scholarships, which is a scholarship we have offered since 2017 to those who are interested in working in the public sector or already working in the public sector, to go to the Blavatsky School of Government at the University of Oxford to undertake a master's in public policy and come back to the civil service of the public sector and use their learnings to help to develop policy. To date, we have funded 27 scholars. But this year we decided to scale up our capacity building efforts, and we have introduced the AIG Public Leaders Program, which is an executive training program aimed at public sector workers who are at directorate level. We are actually bringing the excellent faculty from the University of Oxford to Nigeria and providing scholarships valued at £11,500 each to 50 public sector workers so they can gain the skills and knowledge they need to run their organizations effectively. We actually plan to hold this program every year, and we aim to train up to 100 future public sector leaders every year. The Aig Institute also supports the efforts of the Learning and Development Team of the Office of the Head of the Civil Service, providing consulting services, facilitating program development, such as the LEAD-P program that Dr. Meribole referenced, working on policies and helping to make connections with other private sector entities that would facilitate the talent embedding, peer learning, and mobility assignments that Dr. Dikbeolu referenced. Dr. Dikbeolu also spoke about social interventions and how the private sector actually brought their resources to bear at the height of the Covid-19 pandemic. And the Aig Foundation actually funded the COVID-19 Nigeria Incident and Response Tracker dashboard and predictive analytic platform to facilitate the work of the Presidential Task Force and provide necessary data on resource requirements across the country. So these are just a few examples of the things that we have done across all our entities at the Aig Foundation. And the key to our engagement with the public sector is, first of all, our commitment to the enhancement of public sector transformation. We are deliberate in engaging with the public sector and finding ways in which we can facilitate development, bringing our private sector know-how, bringing our funding to bear. And I think our work is an example of what is possible. Various issues have been discussed, accountability and so forth, but until the private sector actually intentionally engages with the public sector to see ways in which collaboration can be achieved, not much will happen. So rather than sitting back, I encourage all other public sector entities who have the capacity to contribute to public sector transformation to reach out, engage, and I hope that our work has provided a sort of template or example that others can follow. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Aig. Thank you to every speaker we've had so far, especially our co-chair and Mrs. Adetayo, and our keynote speaker, Ms. Dr. Dikbeolu. So we're going into our questions and answer session now, and we have quite a number of questions. We may not be able to take every question, but we would try to take as much as we can, and then the rest we will send to the speakers for their contribution. The first question we'll be taking was specifically addressed to Dr. Dikbeolu. And Dr. Dikbeolu, sir, are you on? Hello, sir.
Yes, very, very much so.
Okay, so David Amata is asking, he says, there has been a high inflation rate since the post-lockdown, where the price of almost every commodity in the market doubled. Are there specific strategies in progress by the government to solve this problem? He has a second question. I don't know if I should take it. I should read it out now, or you want to answer the first before you take the second?
No, if it's to me, let me have both together.
Okay. His second question says, research from Regional Integrated Climate and Economic Model, RICE, has shown that Africa is most vulnerable to the effects of climate. From your point on climate change, you mentioned how Nigeria is shifting to the use of gas. However, a typical passenger gas line vehicle emits about 4.6 metric tons of CO2 per year, which still greatly contributes to climate change. Are there plans on moving to renewable and climate-friendly power generation systems? Those are the two questions, Dr. Dipolu.
Thank you very much, and thank you for those questions. On the inflation rates, I would just say that I think that the inflation rate was also affected by supply shocks which happened as a result of the lockdown in many economies. That's what you found. There was also a contribution, of course, from the injection of resources into the economy, such that money supply expanded quite rapidly. But you will notice that the Central Bank of Nigeria has retained most of its policy parameters in order not, it's a dicey situation. Usually you have, when there's a low growth, you don't have high inflation. But we had that peculiar situation as a result of supply side shocks. So certainly the strategy, I think, which the central bank is holding on to all parameters, is to try and help the economy to work its way out of some of the crisis caused by the supply side parameters, so that as supplies resume, as disruption of services is alleviated and the rest of the economy begins to grow, then they will be in a position, I think, to take a firmer stance on inflation. But right now, I think we're moving in the right direction. Today, we had the growth result of 5.1% in second quarter growth in the GDP. So clearly, as growth resumes, and the central bank certainly will be able to use conventional monetary policy to try and stem inflation. With regard to climate change, I agree with you, but I think a country like Nigeria needs to be careful. It is true that gas is also contributes to CO2 emissions. It is true, but it also contributes less than coal and less than petroleum and oil. So that is true. But the challenge we face is twofold. I think the first one is that we need energy to develop, and some of the cheapest sources of energy for us is gas. And so we are calling for a just transition. We are saying that the speed at which we begin to transit out of gas should not be quite as rapid as the speed with which you want to transit out of coal. And I think closely related to that is to realize that the use of gas also, in a way, contributes to even lower carbon emissions, because then people don't have to use firewood and charcoal for cooking at home. So if you see some of the policy statements by the G7, by the US Treasury recently, I think last week, they actually agreed and made specific exemptions for low-income countries, IDA countries, to be able to use gas and to be able to use gas for household heating. So what we are saying is that, yes, it does contribute to to CO2 emissions, but not as much as the conventional fuels. And perhaps more importantly, it's what we have in abundance that will help us to generate the kind of energy that you need to undertake much needed industrialization. I give you the example of mining. In countries that rely on mining, perhaps not Nigeria, but in other African countries, you need a lot of power to be able to go down into the earth, sometimes 7 stories down, to be able to extract some of those things. Right now, solar power can't give you that kind of energy. It may be in 50 years' time, maybe in 20 years' time, but right now it cannot. And so we have to take that into account. And I'm sure you are also a great traveler. And I always like to tell travelers that, yes, you would like to save on CO2 emissions, but planes use kerosene. And I'm sure you prefer to fly with a jet fuel engine right now than a solar-powered engine right now. So we have to be realistic about some of these things. And what we are saying is that there should be a just transition. It won't force us out of gas just yet, while it can help us to mitigate carbon emissions and help us to boost economic growth. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dipolu, for that answer. I would like to direct the next question to Mr. Aig Mogode, because we know that the AIG has done a lot with the government so far. And the question is by Anne Dankaru. And she asks, how can we attract private initiatives alongside the cooperation and partnerships with the government when the regulatory environment is not consistent? So I think we're just asking, what has been your own success story and what has been your challenges dealing with the government? So Mr. Aig Mogode, please.
Thank you, and Dankar, for the question. Let me say that in my remarks, I said that in a sense, government needs to take the whole business of managing the private sector as a partner, okay, as a very, very serious, specialized function. Now, particularly given that in the case of the Nigerian political economy, the private sector is so important, is such an important partner. If it was not, then, I mean, I wouldn't make this calling. But since it is, the reality is that in a 500 billion GDP country, where GDP contributions by government, are lower than 10%, it just tells you that the rest of the political economy's equation, in other words, the private sector, is too dominant not to bring in and cooperate with and collaborate and basically leverage off its resources. And I'm not talking just about money. I'm talking about beyond money. You're talking about other resources such as intellectual capital, skills, networks, and so on. Now, the issue around what you called regulation, I would just simply say that it's not easy for a private sector partner to embrace government if they feel they're operating under a hostile overall policy context. And that's just fact. If you say you want to partner with me and the way I interpret your policies are that they are hostile to me, is going to be a difficult thing I have to overcome psychologically and in real terms, to become your sustainable partner. Now, I have done my homework with respect to the current policy context. And the more I have looked into the current policy context, the more it's come down to, it's just simply that there is nobody who, or no institution or nobody who has the responsibility of saying, okay, let's coordinate the entirety of our interaction with the public sector, with the private sector in government. And once that takes place, that person or that institution or that team will be tasked with the responsibility of saying, look, these are the needs of the nation, these are the resources of the nation, these are the resources that this nation requires to move forward. Okay, these are the resources in government. I can tell you that any study will show you that the result of that study will be that we need the help and support of the private sector. We can't do it alone. Okay, now how do we manage this large stakeholder group that is so important to us in a way that our policies do not cause them to be a reluctant partner? And I'm not in any way saying that the private sector should capture government or that government should not do what it has to do, either to police, to regulate, and to punish where required the private sector. It's just to say that you can do it in such a sophisticated way that the private sector does not misunderstand your intentions. So those are my views on how to approach this issue.
Thank you very much, sir, for that. The next question, I would direct it to Mr. Aig Scholarships, and it's from Dr. Adeze O. And she says, from an implementation perspective, what policies and initiatives are in place or being considered to encourage and enable private sector engagement in the delivery of quality primary healthcare services nationwide? Shall I take it again? Did you get that, Dr. Scholarships?
Yes, please take that again, please. Thank you.
Okay. It says, from an implementation perspective, what policies and initiatives are in place or being considered to encourage and enable private sector engagement in the delivery of quality primary healthcare services nationwide?
Okay. Thank you very much. I must say that I am not particularly familiar with that area, so I can't say. I don't know whether anybody else on the panel is able to help me in this to answer this question. But what I can do, if nobody else can, is to promise to find out and send you the specific health-related policies to improve the primary health care. I can find that out and send to you as a response. I can do that.
Mr. Chairman, maybe I can respond to your call with a participant to chip in here. Now,
thank you, Dr. Scholarships.
Thank you.
There is, it's a great question. You didn't say who asked the question.
From Dr. Adeze O.
Okay.
That's all she has here, Dr. Adeze O.
Well, thank you for the question. Primary healthcare seems to be our most sustainable and what's the word now? Scalable response to Nigeria's health system challenges. And the process for addressing this strategy started under Professor Koyeransom Kuti, when he was the one who embarked on this movement that led to 30,000 primary healthcare centers across Nigeria today. In terms of count, that's a fantastic number. But the problem has been that less than 10% of these primary healthcare centers are in any state of decent function. And then across board, you have logistics problem, personnel and staffing problems, motivation problems, and so on. And so the question is a real issue for Nigeria. How do we transform our primary healthcare system? Now, working with the Aig Scholarships Foundation has worked with the Private Sector Health Alliance of Nigeria, which was founded by Aliko Dangote, Jimovia, myself, and one or two others, and have come up with a framework to address the very question that has been asked by Dr. Adeze. So the answer to your question lies in that framework, which has been launched and is about to be implemented. It has taken about close to 12 months of a lot of work using Nigerian but highly qualified Nigerian consultants, to come up with this solution. Studies across Nigeria and working with various necessary stakeholders in government. So if you're talking about a game plan from the private sector end of things, we've come up with a game plan and we are confident that it will be embraced by government. It speaks to many of the things that Dr. Dikpeolu said in his paper, but if Nkechi, if you can get her details, and certainly we can put her in touch with the Private Sector Health Alliance of Nigeria, to get a full briefing on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. We will do that. NESG, please get further details so we can respond to that approximately and properly. I have Dr. Meribule's hand up, and I also have Dr. Dikolu's hands up. So I think I would consider Dr. Dikolu first as our keynote speaker. Dr. Meribule, please excuse me, and then you will come up after him. Dr. Dikolu.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, Nkechi. I just wanted to add to what Chairman Aig said. First of all, I'm pleased that he spoke about what the private sector was doing, but the federal government itself has done some work in that regard, not, of course, only around not only around primary healthcare centers, which he has explained exist, but also around thinking about how best to make them functional, how to get the facilities they need, how to get the doctors and the other medical personnel that they need into place. And there was an assignment undertaken by the Bureau of Public Enterprises, which looked at potential for health reform. And that the report of that body is under consideration within government. And I'm sure we will also be able to share some of those details with you. But just to say that it's at the heart of the challenges that our healthcare system is facing, and it's certainly receiving attention. I thought I should just point that out. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir, for that. Dr. Meribule, you have the floor now, please.
So in addition to the contributions, I also want to add that we have policies in place for the primary health care system, because that's the bedrock of the health system. We have the National Health Policy of 2019 that talks more about partnership, both for the private sector development partners as a way of developing the primary healthcare system. We also have the primary healthcare under one roof, which also went down to talk about the partnership. And in terms of framework, the private sector health alliance is also a body that has been in existence for some time. As the chairman of AIG said, he's been working hand in hand, even with the National Primary Healthcare Development Agency, to ensure that we have the right skills, infrastructure, and commodities for the private sector. The person that asked the question can find out more, even from the Primary Healthcare Development Agency. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir, for that as well. The next question was directed to Mrs. Ofowe Aigimogade. Madam, are you on?
Yes, I am.
Okay, and it says, it's from Dr. Francisca Odeka, and it says, should we not have a framework and mechanism for measuring the impact of the initiatives in the public sector that are in place to understand what works?
Okay, so I'm taking that to mean the initiatives that private sector entities bring into the public sector. And yes, I think that is a laudable suggestion. I do think that there are already policies in place that dictate how the private sector engages with the public sector. I know that we are assisting to work on one of those right now, but most private sector entities who are engaged in work like this do have monitoring and evaluation frameworks in place. I know that we do as an organization. And so we learn from our previous experiences and bring that learning to bear in the construction of future projects that we undertake. But as I said earlier, as part of our engagement with the public sector, we are helping to develop policies that will assist private sector entities to engage with the public sector in a more sort of structured way. One of the things that we're working on, for example, with the Learning and Development Department of the Office of the Head of the Civil Service, is to create policies that will allow for the easy transfer of workers from the public sector to the private sector for short-term internships, and for the private sector entities to embed some of their staff in public sector entities for capacity building purposes. So I think the more that private sector entities engage with the public sector, the more understanding there will be of the types of policies that need to be in place that will facilitate these engagements in the future. I hope that's answered the question to some degree.
But Nkechi, I think that just very quickly, just to button so that since Mrs. Aig Scholarships is in flow, you restricted your answer to private sector initiatives. But I think holistically, the whole issue is that it's not about measuring what the private sector has done, it's measuring how the government and the public sector performs, whether it is as a result of interventions that are supported by the private sector or not. Of course, if we measure how the public sector performs, then we can know whether the areas in which the private sector have intervened, So could you talk about the index?
Yes, so our intention actually is to, working with the GIPC of the NESG, we are working on something that we call the Public Sector Index, the Aig Scholarships Public Sector Index, which will look at specific ministries, departments, and agencies and assess their performance along certain criteria. And the goal is to provide information both to the government and to the public about what has worked and what has not worked, relative performance over time as well. And we do this, or we intend to do this from next year, starting with a few pilot MDAs. And the idea is to show the government what agencies are performing and why they are performing in this way. The goal is hopefully that the digitalization efforts that we are working on right now, for example, for the Office of Head of the Civil Service and other entities, will reflect in the performance levels that the index shows. So this should be available towards the middle or the end of next year. And the idea is to do this on an annual basis so that over time we can track performance changes, hopefully based on the interventions that both the private sector and the public sector make in specific areas.
All right, thank you very much, Mrs. Ofowe Aikimogade, for that. I saw Dr. Dikpolu's hand up earlier on. Dr. Dikpolu, do you still want to say something on this?
No, I was going to talk about the index.
Okay, thank you very much. A question is here for Dr. Mary Bole from Adeze Shoko. Dr. Mary Bole, are you on? Dr. Mary Bole, yes, okay. So it says, is there work being done to provide digital infrastructure? For example, computers, internet, data protection policies to get public officials to use these platforms to provide better services? Where is this being piloted? And is there a plan to scale these efforts up?
Yes, like I said when I was speaking, there's an effort to provide digital infrastructure. One of the pillars of the new plan, Federal Civil Service Strategy and Implementation Plan 2021 to 2025, is the digitalization of contents. Like I said, with the support of the African Initiative for Governance, we've been able to develop standard operating procedure, which is actually the first in a series of knowing how government works, to be able to digitize our contents. We're also planning with them to ensure that we have the infrastructure such as computers and what have you that civil servants work with. We're also talking with Galaxy Backbone to ensure that the services like internet services that they provide becomes more optimized so that we'll be able to have this, and also to create a standard so that as MDAs are putting this in their different budgets, to be able to have money to do that, we have a standard template so that information sharing can also be well done. In a nutshell, that's where I'm going to stop because we are running late. Thank you.
All right, sir. Thank you very much. We still have some questions, but I would please ask the participants to please send them to the Secretariat. We will compile them and have the speakers answer them and send them back to you. Before I hand over to our co-chair private sector to give us the closing remarks, I would just like to say one or two things on GIPC. A lot has been said about GIPC. We are one of the policy commissions in NESG, Governance and Institutions Policy Commission. We have 3 thematic groups. That is the Strengthening Partnership between the Public and Private Sector thematic group. That is headed by Dr. Adeyemi Dipolu. We also have the Measuring Performance thematic group that is headed by Mrs. Ofowe Aig. And finally, we have the Supporting Civil Service Reforms, which is headed by Mrs. Efweko Okaru. Our co-chairs are Mr. Aig and the head of service, Dr. Esong. Please join the GIPC. What we essentially stand for is to improve governance and to strengthen the relationship between the public sector and the private sector. And as Mrs. Aig has already hinted, we are also working with AIG for measuring for the Measuring Performance thematic group and index, which will be evidence-based on how to measure the performance of government. So that is what GIPC is. My name is Mrs. Nkechi Onyanso. I am the facilitator for the GIPC. You can reach me through any of the details, contact details already put on the chat by the NESG Secretariat, so we can talk more, and we'll be happy to have you join the GIPC as we work together to build the Nigerian economy. On this note, I will hand over to the co-chair private sector of the GIPC, Mr. Aig, for his final remarks and the closing remarks for this event. Mr. Aig.
Thank you. Thank you, Nkechi. Now, we have overshot our time by some minutes, so I'm going to have to really bring us home fast. It's been a wonderful discussion, and I want to really express appreciation to our keynote speaker, Dr. Dikpeolu, and then of course to the other panelists, Akisha Eto, Dr. Mary Bole, the powerhouse, Ms. Ofowe Aig, to our facilitator, she's played the role of moderator. She's also a GIPC facilitator, Nkechi Onyeso. Well done to you all for a fantastic job. I'm not going to attempt to bring out all the nuggets from this discussion, but because there are several. What I would suggest very strongly, however, is that we kind of create, even if it's a 2-page summary, which we can send out to all members of the NESG and other stakeholders. But of course, this is going to be available on YouTube and other digital platforms for people to take a look at. The one thing I'd like to leave us with, however, is that we've spoken at length about the fact that challenges existed pre-COVID, that there were efforts underway to address the strengthening of government in collaboration with the private sector, and that there is a real urgency for execution around these various initiatives. The 2 strategic plans, that's the what we call the predecessor or old plan, 2017 to 2020 FSIP, and the one that is about to be the new plan, the successor plan, 2021-2025 FSIP, that will soon be approved by government, need to be implemented ASAP. Digitization of government, capacity building, welfare of public servants, and all the other key issues that will strengthen the ability of government to deliver goods and services in a way that Nigerians haven't enjoyed in several decades. That's what, at the end of the day, we are all working towards. What I would then like to end on is that if we leverage up Dr. Dikpeolu's presentation, and we look at this issue of deliberation councils, and he mentioned that the Presidential Quarterly Business Forum is one such deliberation council. Of course, even within, the FSIP strategy, where Dr. Dikpeolu, myself, Dr. Mary Bole, and others, operate under the chairmanship of Dr. Folashade Yemi, the head of service. We also have a reporting line to the president through the Presidential Quarterly Meeting. I think that we're going to have to use these two deliberation councils very, very soon to invite the private sector for the alliance required, the sustainable, elegant, sophisticated alliance required to support the FSIP platform. So this is an early invitation to all. Probably in the next 30 days, those presidential invitations, I can't speak, for the office of the president, but maybe before, well before the end of this year, those invitations should be forthcoming, where the private sector and at the very heights of government will sit down and say, okay, how do we make sure that the public service, performs in a way we haven't seen in several decades together? On that note, I would like to thank everybody for dialing in. I truly hope you enjoyed yourself. I did tremendously. God bless us all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, NESG.
Thank you. Thank you.